Russia can still get quite a lot, but a lot of them are very poorly trained. And therefore, the question about what more can be achieved by fighting.
Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
A pleasure, as always.
Well, and for me, at least so far. Your column yesterday talked about the possible outlines of a Ukraine peace deal. Before we get to those outlines themselves, why is there an assumption building that a deal might emerge next year? Is it all to do with Donald Trump, or is it to do with just sort of incremental weariness on both sides too?
Well, I think both of the above, really. I mean, both sides have really suffered greatly on the human level. So, it's very difficult for Ukraine and Russia to get enough soldiers still and to train enough soldiers. Russia can still get quite a lot, but a lot of them are very poorly trained. And therefore, the question about what more can be achieved by fighting, the question that often becomes general when two countries locked in a bitter conflict decide to stop or pause it. Is there really any point carrying on? And then you've got the added impetus of Trump coming in, Putin. The conventional wisdom, particularly among Ukrainians, is Putin's not interested. He just wants to drive on to total victory. He doesn't care, that kind of stuff. Whereas Putin has said that he is willing to talk peace with Donald Trump and to sort of take it seriously and to engage. So I think the signs are there in terms of the diplomatic dance. I mean, what we don't know yet, as an absolute certainty, is that they will go into meaningful peace talks, because a lot of the kind of scoping that takes place around this, internationally with diplomatic envoys and go-betweens and back channels, we obviously don't know about. I mean, we found out earlier this year about something that had been going on in Qatar. And that kind of thing is probably still going on at a level that we don't really know about, to try and prepare the ground for what the broad scope of a negotiation would be. But look, the signs are that within the next weeks or possibly months, some kind of much more serious attempt to negotiate an end to this will start.
Without that happening, the expectation one would think would be that America, if not switching off support, draws down support, and Russian advances increase, and Ukraine gets pushed further and further on the back foot. But presumably even then, that doesn't involve the kind of storming of Kyiv that we once talked about.
I think that's very unlikely. I mean, one of the things that we've seen this year, and the defence intelligence and other people have talked about it, is there have been moments where the Russians really have had something of a breakthrough. They've really broken the Ukrainians in certain parts of the front. But the interesting thing, they say, is that the Russian army is too ground down to take advantage. It's been too ground down to sort of rush forces through those gaps they've created and exploit them and take big tracts of territory. So I think the hope that there could be a military decision, the hope on the side of the Kremlin, that is not that likely. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could stop this happening. Ukraine and Russia might both decide they want to fight on. Yeah. But a lot of the predictions about the Russian economy, arms supply, stuff like that, but by the middle of 2025 are very, very bleak. So, and we know things are pretty bleak in Ukraine on multiple fronts. So I think it's likely that they will enter into a serious process of negotiation.
Well, let's talk about what a deal might look like then, because you explain in your column that part of the problem is and has always been that President Zelensky, he's flatly rejected freezing the conflict on the lines where they currently have control in the past. I mean, which I guess is mainly but not just Crimea.
No, well, of course, what's happened, there was the ground taken in 2014, 2015, when the previous freezing of this took place, the so-called Minsk agreements. Now, Zelensky has always said, I don't want another version of the Minsk agreements, and there's a widespread consensus in Ukrainian society that would just kick the can down the road. As soon as the Russians had rebuilt their military, they'd come back for another go. So the conversation really now, and I think it's the key conversation between Zelensky and some of his Western allies, is if we take that view of Russia how do we build up our own defences to the point that that really would be very unattractive to Russia, i.e. to make better use of whatever time an armistice like this would gain to build up Ukrainian defence than Russia is able to use to rebuild its offensive capability. So all sorts of things have been talked about. I mean, one of the big efforts is for a lot more weapons to be produced in Ukraine, missiles, shells, all that sort of stuff. And for a much larger scale, probably, of training of Ukrainian troops abroad. There's some very interesting ideas being kicked around. I don't think they really have any real status, but if one is flying kites about possibly keeping garrisons of Ukrainian troops outside Ukraine so that they would, for example, serve the American security interests in Germany, backfill troops that Trump would want to take out of Germany as part of a tilt towards the Pacific. I mean, this is all, as I say, blue sky thinking, speculation at this point, because the really difficult circle to square is the one where, Russia says, we want you to be neutral, not a member of NATO. That's not a problem. Trump says that's not going to happen. Germany says that's not going to happen. But we also want Ukraine to be militarily weak. Well, that really is problematic, I think, for almost everybody in NATO. And that's where there is a big gulf between what Russia would try and insist on and what Ukraine and its allies would try and insist on.
Is there anybody talking credibly about a situation a bit like, say, after the Second World War, where you had, American mainly, but effectively NATO troops garrisoned in Germany as a defence against the East? Would we expect in peacetime there perhaps to be NATO troops in Ukraine?
It's conceivable. Clearly Russia would kick and shout and make scenes about it all. Once again, I think creative thinking might go on there. For example, if you said, well, in an emergency or time of tension, we would have plans to move an American brigade or a French brigade or whatever into Ukraine, you could pre-position their equipment so that the task and time taken to make that happen would be very, very short. You could do it in a couple of days. That kind of thing could conceivably be on the agenda. Once again, Russia would try and kick and scream and stop that happening. Quite interesting, though, to see the French foreign minister on Saturday in an interview with the BBC saying once again, not ruling out sending French troops to Ukraine. Now, in the past, when this was said by President Macron, this was, if the Russians are in full flood towards Kyiv, we might have to intervene. But it could also be relevant in the context of some kind of armistice or deal, because let's not forget, up until the full-scale invasion of February 2022, until shortly before that, there were NATO training missions in Ukraine. There was British, American, Canadian, lots of NATO countries were involved in the country. So it's not exactly unprecedented to have troops from those countries in Ukraine.
Let's turn to Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He's giving a speech to the NATO Cyber Defence Conference at Lancaster House today, and he's going to warn that Russia is prepared to launch a series of cyber attacks on Britain and other NATO members as it seeks to weaken support for Ukraine. What does this kind of warfare look like? How will we notice this happening?
So the interesting thing, some people used to talk about grey zone warfare, by which they mean state actions that go below the threshold of all armed conflict. So things you can do, but maybe you deny it, or maybe you leave things unclear as to who's responsible.
You do it while smirking a lot
exactly.
of the time. Yeah.
Well, it is a form of trolling, you could argue, to try and take down certain types of website or plant malicious software or messages even. That's been going on for quite a long time. I mean, my read of the Pat McFadden speech is to say Russia has shown its displeasure about the UK giving the okay to Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles for deep strikes. Therefore, we need to be aware of the possibility it may step up some of these grey zone actions. Now, cyber warfare has been part of life for quite a few years now, since well before the invasion of Ukraine. So he's talking about a possible stepping up of that into areas where the public would notice it. So in the speech, he's going to talk about, the lights going off or whatever, if the power infrastructure is subject to a cyber attack. And so that kind of thing is clearly a possibility. I mean, we've seen some other strange things in recent days, like these drones over the American airfields.
We've in fact had people messaging saying, ask Mark Urban about the drones over airfields. Yeah, so there we go.
The public awaits. Well, I mean, look, this is really interesting, and I think, we don't know. I mean, it could be some hobbyists, some people trolling the US Air Force. Equally, it could be a facet of this type of action, sort of grey zone action. And it may well be because the intelligence agencies have briefed about some of the attacks on people making weapons, for example. There's been arson attacks, and there's even been a plot to kill the head of one of the big German weapons-making companies, uncovered by security services in Europe. That some of this is being done through proxies, and people are talking about criminal gangs or other types of people. Now, have the GRU, Russian military intelligence, hired some people to fly drones over US air bases in East Anglia or wherever? It is possible.
It's a hell of a Guy Ritchie film. Wow, yeah. That's
look, it's all of this stuff is now possible, including, as I've said, arson attacks and all the rest of it. So that is all part of this environment now that Pat McFadden is talking about.
Remarkable. Look, you've been tweeting and doing whatever one does on Blue Sky. I'm not sure what the word is. Posting, let's go with, recently about the possibility of Israel and Lebanon being close to ending the fighting in Lebanon. That sounds very exciting.
Well,
rare good news, if true. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So the US envoy was talking this up even 10 days ago, saying that he was close to an agreement. But of course, everybody knew with this, well, those who look at Benjamin Netanyahu as an obstacle to peace would say, oh, no, he'll keep it going or whatever. But there has been some interesting reporting out of Israel in the last 24 hours that suggests that Netanyahu is willing to go with this, has put it to the cabinet, and that in broad terms, the Israeli cabinet agrees to this deal. Now, the US envoy had already said that the Lebanese government had agreed to the deal. So it looks like the pieces are falling into place. There are some unanswered questions, but critically, it would seem that the will is there on both sides. Clearly, there's been a lot of suffering in Lebanon in terms of the thousands of people killed, the displacement of, I think, something like 1 million people by this. Lebanon wants to bring this to a halt. And actually, I think the Israeli military assessment, such as we understand it from what's said publicly, is that the job has basically been done in dealing a major blow to Hezbollah and trying to do certain things to disrupt its future operations in the south of the country. But that's going to be the key with that peace agreement. The framework goes back to a deal that was brokered by the UN back in 2006 during a previous round of fighting. The Israelis have said, we want that UN resolution 1701 plus. Yeah. And their pluses are to do with mechanisms which would involve the US to basically spy on the south of Lebanon to make sure that Hezbollah wasn't coming back in to positions close to the Israeli border, which it's not supposed to do under that 2006 agreement, and possibly to allow the Israelis under certain circumstances to strike militarily. Pretty extraordinary if Lebanon, as a sovereign state, supposedly, goes along with giving the Israelis some kind of powers to strike in the south of their country if they believe their security is threatened. But that seems to be the shape of the deal that's taking place.
And finally, Mark, and very briefly, how significant are they treating in Israel the ICC arrest warrants from last week?
Well, there's been the rhetorical, the expressions of outrage and all the rest of it. It's clearly a blow. If you're on the liberal side of Israeli politics, it's a shameful thing. If you're on the nationalist side, it's to hell with them, and there's still plenty of places we can go to. Shopping trips to Europe for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant are a thing of the past, it would seem.
Yeah, indeed. Look, Mark Urban, thank you very much indeed. You can, of course, hear Mark this time every Monday, and you can read him in the Sunday Times every week.